Washburn. I'm the director of the Visiting Writers Series, and I'm here to tell you to turn off your cell phone. And don't text during the reading. Don't surf the internet. Don't do things that annoy people. So, okay. This reading is sponsored by the English Department and the Student Fee Council. And I would like to thank them. And before I go any further, I would also like to thank everyone who helped so much to get the reading ready for tonight. There's some steps over here. So I just wanted to thank Lori Martin for writing press release, and Chris for making posters and flyers, and Jeremy for hauling over lots of equipment, and then they all did other stuff too. And also Shannon in the English department helped a lot. So I just want to thank those people. I would also mention that, as you might have seen as you came upstairs, we are having a reception after this in the lobby with some Pepperidge Farm cookies. Maybe not enough. And but there's others. There's little tomatoes. And at the reception, you'll have a chance to talk to Jo, and also you can buy her book, and I'm sure she will sign it for you. We do have some copies of the book for sale. The proceeds from that sale go to benefit the Celtic Review Literary Magazine, and they also have a few books by past visiting writers for sale at bargain prices. Our next reading will be in November, and I don't remember anything else about that. Anybody want to help me out here? Lori Martin. Jeffrey Nutter. Who knows the date? November
19th or 20th?
First Thursday, November, I think.
You can trust these people. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce Jo McDougall. I have a few facts I want to tell you about Jo, but I thought I should probably talk a little bit about Jo. Although that's a little bit awkward because there's so many people in this audience who know Jo McDougall far better than I do. I was never lucky enough to have the privilege of working in the same department with Jo McDougall, although I was lucky enough not to work in the same department with Jo McDougall. And that just means I got a job. Anyway, but I did get to see the kinds of things Jo McDougall did in her classes, because she passed on her syllabi for craft and poetry to me, and she passed on worksheets, and I'm still using them, and sometimes I give her credit, and sometimes I don't. I've also gotten to meet Jo quite a few times at conferences and here on campus. And of course, after I came here to teach, Jo had taught here before, and she co-directed the creative writing program and ran this series. And I watched videotapes of the series, and I saw Jo introducing people, and I thought, oh, wow, she did a good job. Or I can't. Well, I'm Southern too, but it doesn't come off the same. And anyway, I started reading Jo's books, and that's the important thing. That was a wonderful discovery for me. Many of Jo's poems, not all of them, but many of them are short lyrics, no flab, so tight, and I don't see how she can do it. They're so moving and so meaningful, and I've memorized a few of them, or I used to have memorized a few of them to say to my students, and I was so impressed with her work. And when she visits our classes on campus, such an excellent teacher. So that's my personal statement about Jo, and she's nice too. And then, as far as I know. Well, we're going to hear from the memoir, so but I thought I would read a few facts. So Jo McDougall has written 5 poetry collections, all excellent, as well as her memoir, which you'll be hearing from tonight. Her work has also inspired other artists. She's had poems turned into a film, play, musical, scores. So that's pretty impressive as well. She's had fellowships to the McDougall Colony, has won the DeWitt Wallace been in multiple journals and several anthologies, including Good Poems for Hard Times, edited by Garrison Keillor. I think there are a lot of poets who would just like, look, so, that's right up there. And she's been inducted into the Arkansas Writers Hall of Fame, although we claim her in Kansas. And so, as you may know, Jo was a native of Arkansas, but she lives in Leawood, Kansas now, and as I mentioned, she was a Pitt State professor. During that time, she was named Teacher of the Year by the PSU chapter of Sigma Tau Delta. And more recently, our literary magazine, the Cow Creek Review, has renamed the Poetry Award in her honor, as well. And Mr. Cagle is here, and the Fiction Award is in his honor. So, now we have an undergraduate fiction award in his honor, and the graduate award in Karen Stoll's honor. In any case, I'll read his quote and I'll turn it over to Jo. Poet Miller Williams says, Jo McDougall's memoir is a joy to read for the story itself, but the joy is even greater for the use to which she puts the English language. Similes and metaphors abound that are rarely found in prose. And I give you Jo.
Well, I think I should just go home. That's wonderful. What a great introduction. Thank you. And how wonderful to see all of you here. Can you hear me in the back? Yes? No? All right. Is this better? Better now? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Laura. And thank the English Department and the Visiting Writers Series and the Bee Council and all the wonderful people who helped put this together. I know from having done this myself, it is not easy. The details are endless, aren't they, Charles? Charles and I did this too, and it's just endless, and it takes a village to make this happen. It is absolutely wonderful to see friends and colleagues, and I must tell you, I have a person whose poetry I've been working with who has come here from Delaware, Linda Glassby and her husband, and I'm just delighted that they altered their trip itinerary to come here. That's just lovely. I thank Chris Anderson and Jeremy Johnson and Shannon Spear and all of you folks who have really made this happen. And all of you could be at home watching TV, walking out under the moon. It is beautiful. Grading papers. Oh, yeah, and here you are. But thank you so much. And it is really good to be home again in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh feels like home. Charles and I were here for 11 years. I loved it. I lived on one of those old brick streets. I taught at PSU. I had congenial folks to work with. I was under the mentorship of Stephen Meeks, and it is here at PSU where I think I really I learned how to be a teacher, and I learned how to value myself as a poet, because I had such great colleagues. And when I needed support, you were here, and I want to thank you so much for that. Well, I have a lot of points about Pittsburgh, and I'm not going to read too many of them, but there is one that was published in the Little Boffin's Review. And I want to say, Laura, thank you for that, for telling the places where I've been published. But actually, I think the place I'm really proud to be published in is Little Boffin's Review and the Midwest Quarterly, because they are from this area, which I value greatly. Can you still hear me? Tell me if you can. Okay. This is about a cat I had named Bo. And there are one or two of you in the audience who will remember Bo, a black, mischievous cat who got into all kinds of trouble. I was a new hire here, living out on East 8th Street, and the cat got away at an ungodly hour, and it was snowing, and nobody knows me, and I'm out looking for my cat, and I'm thinking, if they see this crazy woman out here, I may not ever get to go home again. Respect. At 2 a.m., a woman's cat goes missing. She finds him atop a telephone pole, pretending that he cannot climb down what he's just climbed up. At 2:30 a.m., the woman calls her husband, 300 miles away. She muses that if the cat touches the wrong wire, she shouldn't touch the body. Leave him alone, the husband grouses. He'll come home. The woman speculates that it doesn't seem respectable that the cat go poof and she be asleep. She stays up all night, listening for the lights to go out. Now, when I read this to my friend and colleague Charles Cagle, he said, "Poor Charles, somebody should have warned him before he married him." Unfortunately, nobody did, or at least he didn't listen. But I do want to say that not only is Charles a listener to stories about cats, but he is the person who aids and abets the writer as she goes on readers' tours, and that means loosely translated luggage lifter and moral supporter. So I think we ought to give a hand to Charles. I want to read another poem that was written while I lived here in Pittsburgh. Of course, we all know where Meadowlark Mall is. You've never seen a Meadowlark out there, but that's the name of it. And they used to have circuses that came to town and set up camp out there. And sometimes there's not a lot to do in Pittsburgh, so here comes this flea bag circus, and off I go. What we need. It is just as well we do not see, in the shadows behind the hasty tent of the Allen Brothers' greatest show, Lola, the lion tamer, and the great Valdini, in Nikes and jeans, sharing a tired cigarette. Before she girds her wrist with listening amulets and snaps the tigers into rage, before he adjusts the glimmering cummerbund and makes from air the white and trembling doves, the pair. Now that wasn't Fleabag Circus, let me tell you. But it was great. Tonight I'm going to read mostly from my new memoir, Daddy's Money. It finally is out after many years. I'm not going to tell you how many. So many I'm kind of ashamed of it. I used to put it down on my, faculty evaluations. You have to turn in progress reports, and I would, every year I'd put down work in progress memoir. Steve Leeds got ready to just roll his eyes and turn my report. But it is here, and the game plan is, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why we should not write a memoir, and why I wrote one anyway, and the challenges I faced, and read some excerpts from the book, and then we'll have question and answers afterwards, and then, as Laura mentioned, book signing. Now, there's over 20 pages of photographs in here, so even if you don't want to read it, you might want to just buy it. Now, is anybody here currently writing a memoir or thinking about it? You're not going to fess up, are you? Well, if you are, you might want to think twice. There are a lot of reasons not to write one. It takes a terrible amount of time, so you might want to ask yourself, is this trip really necessary? The New York Times ran a review in January, and they reviewed this woman reviewed 4 memoirs. She hated them all, except one, which she kind of liked. She said, why should you write a memoir? The field's already bloated with it. We've got all kinds of people telling everybody everything anyway. We've got Facebook, we've got, LinkedIn, we've got Plaxo, we've got texting. You're not texting, are you? So why does anybody want to go into the field of telling everything to everybody? Good question. You shouldn't write to make the reader share your misery. And you really maybe should just, if you think about it, you should just, if you're writing it, you just should shut up. If you don't have a compelling story, one that hasn't already been told, maybe you just don't want to do it. You want to take the meat out of the memoir. A reader wants to know the writer's reactions to the events, but she doesn't want to hear all about all of your problems. And memoir writing ought to be a shared discovery. So if you, as a writer, are not discovering something as you write, the reader's not going to discover anything in either. Consider the field, and this is very discouraging. If you browse the internet for memoirs, you will have between 40,000 and 160,000 hits. It makes you stop and think. Now, so why did I write one? Well, I hadn't read this review. And it was already at the press, at the UVA Press, University of Arkansas Press, and they said they would take it, so I thought, I'm not going to write the vote here. But I maybe should have just hit the delete key and congratulated myself for having lived a perfectly good, undistinguished life. And if you do that, there's no shame in that. And of course, no writer's going to take that advice. So why did I write? Well, I wrote it because I thought I had a story. I had grown up on a rice farm in southern Arkansas, and I don't think that, as far as I know, no one's written about living on a rice farm in Arkansas. John Grissom almost beat me to it. He wrote about growing up on a cotton farm, but that's totally different. I tell myself anyway. I wanted to solve some mysteries about who my parents and grandparents and ancestors really were. I wanted to find out how that farm and that life had shaped me as a writer. And I wanted to find out how sometimes I'm totally crazy. And then I wanted to summon the lost. So in this memoir, I started it off with a poem called Summoning the Lost. I don't like writing about the dead, conjuring them in language that some of them never would have used, pushing them on stage saying, go, it doesn't have to be the truth. Something's varnished about that. All plead lights and rouge, all blistery shadows. Yet what else is there to do? Shouldn't you, reader, be led to see these glossy, passionate, stumping souls who once plowed a field in the teeth of a tornado, waltzed with a wooden leg, sashayed an armadillo on a leash? Perhaps not. Perhaps you've already left the page, dealing with your own ghost, throwing them over your shoulder like salt. A grandmother, a child, a brother missing in action, who smoked every day a pack of Camels and had a way with mules. The title of Daddy's Money is, I call it that, because it is about a rice farm, and it is the rice that made the money what little of it there was. And so I started out with, in chapter 1, kind of setting the stage for what this setting was, place and time. Daddy, and remember now, if you're in the South, you always call your father Daddy. Nobody ever says father. You go to your grave calling you may be 75 and you're still calling Daddy, Daddy. The son of Belgian immigrants who came to Arkansas in 1906 was christened Leon Joseph Garreau. Correctly pronounced Garreau, but Americanized to Garreau. He farmed rice, oats, and soybeans on Arkansas's Grand Prairie, a subregion of the Delta, named for its sargasso sea of prairie grass, now essentially extinct. Grand Prairie dirt stretches as far and as flat as a countertop between the Arkansas and the White River. Our farm, 1,100 acres, lay in the heart of it, some 30 miles from the legendary Mississippi River. We traded in DeWitt, a town some 75 miles southeast of Little Rock, the capital and center of the state. DeWitt's population numbered around 2,500 in 1935, the year that I was born. Now here's another reason not to write a memoir, but sooner or later you have to tell how old you are. In my growing up, there had been an ample house, an elm to climb, a haystack, a barn. It smells of manure and wasting leather. Beyond the house, the Fairbanks engine rose, tall as a church. It powered the well that pumped the water, that grew the rice, that made Daddy's money. Now, while my father was out seeing about the Fairbanks pump or fixing a levee or fooling with a broken tractor, my mother could be found sometimes murdering chickens. And she thought I ought to learn about it. Mother places one foot on the chicken's head and yanks. It flops a few feet in the stingy grass, blood spurting from its headless neck. I'm 9 years old, standing in the drought-bitten yard beside my mother, learning how to dispatch a chicken. Hold it upside down by the feet, put its head under your foot, and separate its head from its neck. Blood spatters Mother's shoes and cotton stockings, but she doesn't seem to notice. On this summer morning in 1944, my father herds his rusted pickup back and forth across the farm, checking a rice field, or fixing a broken tractor, or feeding the cows. My sister, Nancy Ruth, my only sibling, is not yet born. The sun irons the moisture out of the sky, wilting the floor clocks and cannons along the backyard cement walk. My mother dispatches 3 or 4 more chickens and then turns to me. You do it, she says. This time you learn. The chicken's severed head leans against my shoe, its eyes dumbfounded. Chicken blood reproaches my bare legs. Mother murmurs her approval. Good, she says, but next time just make a quicker pull. You don't want to torture it. Now, there are a lot of challenges in writing a novel or a memoir or anything in which you have to sustain prose for more than 2 or 3 pages. For a poet, that's really hard to do. And what you have to have, as everybody knows, is basic. You've got to have conflict. Now, my biggest problem was I had a happy childhood. And I don't know what you're going to do as a writer with a happy childhood. But one thing about it, the more I started writing, the more I realized, yes, there was conflict. I just didn't recognize all of it. And there was a great deal of conflict between my sister and me as we were older and were the executresses of my father's estate. I used to love to say that. I am an executress of my father's estate. It turned out not very well. Bad things happened between my sister and me, and we are now estranged. So there was that conflict. And I deal with that a little bit in the book, and in chapter 2, which I'll read just a little paragraph or 2. This is called Red Wagon. On a sullen March morning in 1997, frost had set up housekeeping on the north sides of fence posts. The steely smell of sleet filled the air. Mother had been dead 12 years, my father 3. Recently retired from teaching at Pittsburgh State University in Kansas. My husband and I had moved to Little Rock. My son Duke and I had come to the Gayrow home place to witness the auction of my father's farm implements, the contents of outbuildings and shops and sheds, the remnants of a farm, a life. My daughter, Charlotte Jo Stone, diagnosed in 1986 with melanoma and undergoing chemotherapy, has stayed at home. Like chicks trailing a mother hen, the crowd, farmers, collectors, antique dealers, and the merely curious followed the auctioneer to file inside my father's farm shop, once his unofficial office, where repairs had been made, the day planned, and orders given to the hired men. The diesel oil smell of the dirt floor rose undiluted as if Dad had just opened the door and were walking to the vise. We stopped before a child's red, rusted wagon, pulled from its customary place in its workbench. It languished, smaller than I remembered. most of its paint gone, missing 2 wheels. Yet it seemed to mesmerize everyone. A man standing beside me, an antique dealer probably, overrode my every bid. Finally, perhaps sensing my anguish, he edged closer to me. Was that your wagon? I nodded. He stepped away. Then my sister, calling from the back of the crowd, bid an outrageous price, and the wagon was gone. Well, that's kind of a metaphor for how things went. Then I realized, as I was writing it, that there was some conflict between my mother and father. That wasn't all that bad, but as a child I thought it was. But, I thought they were ancient. I thought they were old people, and they were just in their 20s. Late 20s when I was born. When I can remember, they were just starting out as a married couple. But there were arguments, and I did hear quite a few of them. And one of the big arguments was the fact that my mother, although she'd grown up on a farm, was sick and tired of the dust. Sick and tired of mosquitoes. Now, if you're going to be on a rice farm in southern Arkansas, you're going to have mosquitoes. My mother wanted out of the stuff of which my days and nights and dreams were made of. Sounds of mosquitoes, killdeer, and tree frogs, endless fields, honeysuckle and orange, aching leaves, dust. My mother hounded father endlessly. Dust and mosquitoes, I despise them. Our house was an easy 3-mile drive from town, partly on macadam, partly on a dirt road, straight as a broom handle. Indeed, the dust did spew behind the car in vaulting rooster tails. It settled on everything in the house. Invited in before air conditioning. You do remember air conditioning? By the attic fan. You remember the attic fan. Even after the house was outfitted with window air conditioners in the mid-1950s, dust found us. In spring and summer, battalions of mosquitoes sauntered through the finest of fine mesh screens. My father would respond to Mother's haranguing that he was not about to move into town. That she'd, after all, married a farmer. For God's sake, Ruth, he'd say, you knew what I was when you married me. He reminded her that she had a damn good life, and if she'd wanted the 9 to 5, trimmed grass, know what every day is going to bring you kind of life, she should have married that weasel she dated before him. A dentist, for Christ's sake. But they stayed together until my mother died. They were married over 50 years. So there was conflict, and there were other challenges, which if you write a memoir, you will run into. All of those of you who are lucky enough to be fiction writers know you've got to have not only conflict, but you've got to have a storyline. You've got to have an underlying storyline. I realized I didn't have one, and so I had to get one. And I decided that my underlying storyline would be the love of the land that all the characters in my family, all the people in my family shared. And not only a love of the land, but a great obligation to it. Now, it isn't easy to be a farmer, and many of you know this, many of you grew up on farms. And there are many things that go wrong. Some years you don't make anything, some years you do. But you never know. It's a gamble. And Charles's grandfather came to Arkansas a little later than my grandfather and bought some land. Now, Charles's grandfather was from Chicago. He came down to Arkansas, bought the land, experienced the heat and the mosquitoes, and went back to Chicago. And said to Charles's father, you go down there and farm it. But he was a little sympathetic to the problems that were there, and when we ran across some letters, and in it, the elder McDougall says to his son, you might as well trade that land for a yellow dog. Shoot the dog and come on back to Chicago. Well, fortunately for me, Charles much later. But really, one of the hardest things about writing a memoir was that I am by nature a poet. And I had to keep pushing the language down on the page and saying, you can't float out like you want to in poetry. You have to stay and be prose. But then there's a fine line that you have to meet because you want texture, you want some interest for the reader, you want some figures of speech and imagery, but you can't have too many. Or else your story just is not believable. But every now and then I would say, okay, I can find a way to write little poetic passages in here. And this is about a ritual that went on with one of my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, who had come to Belgium, as I said, carved out this farm from this prairie grass, which was everywhere and very hard to get rid of. Had passed the farm on down to my father, and he had gone off out of the mosquitoes and heat and gone to Hot Springs, Arkansas to live on Lake Hamilton. Built a little cottage there, and I was fortunate enough to go there 1 week out of every summer. Now, the great thing about going, of course, to your grandparents is that there are not that many rules like there are at home. And there's also a kind of a ritual. And my grandfather always said on the second day of my visit, it's time to go feed the goldfish. Now, he had this cottage on a sloping, very steeply sloping lot down to the lake, and so he built the cottage up, of course, on the hill with view, and then he terraced all of the land down to the lake, and the goldfish lived on the second terrace. On the second day of my visit, we're departing for the morning's first solemn chore, feeding the goldfish that live in the midst of Granddad's sumptuous gardens. To make the steeply sloping property navigable, Grandfather created gardens on 4 levels leading from house to lake. He designed and sculpted the concrete terrace walls and finial urns that mark each set of connecting steps. The sun rides my shoulders like a sleeping cat as Granddad and I, fish food in hand, head down the garden steps to the expected fish. They wait in a small pool, featuring a fountain with 4 sculptured frogs, one for each point of the compass. When I'm not looking, Granddaddy turns a handle at the base of the pool, and water gushes as if by source out of the frogs' mouths. A lizard rattles through the grass. I measure the fish food according to Granddaddy's instructions. A motorboat, all power and noise, fades in the distance. Far from the hurtling business of the farm, I'm standing in almost unnerving serenity. Grandfather, once the overseer of pumpkin plants, harrows, and threshing machines, imparts to this moment an even, patient gloss, quiet as the stubbing out of a cigarette. Now, while I would be in Hot Springs having a wonderful time, skipping around, I'm like very pretending I'm Hetty Lamar and Dorothy Lamour, practicing my horrible tap dance steps. My mother and father are contending with big problems on the farm occasionally. Some 100 miles away from the mountains of Hot Springs, under a delta sky gorging itself on heat, my father stalks through one of his fields, cursing the drought, the shriveled soybeans. Sweat drenches his khaki shirt. It clings to his back like an overgrown barnacle. It doesn't look good, he says to my mother at supper. Don't buy anything you don't have to. He lifts a slice of ham onto his plate. When's Joe coming home from Hot Springs? In a few days. Mother folds and refolds her napkin. The wall clock, misguided always by 40 minutes, ticks on. She's going to need new school clothes. No, my father slams down his fork. Not till it rains. If it ever rains. Rain, too much, not enough, drought. Splitting open the dirt of the fields, grasshoppers, blackbirds, stripping the grain. These are my Father's enemies. He pushes back from the table. If it rains within the week, I'll have you clothes to enter the third grade, and my Father will admire them. If not, I'll hear my parents argue in life. It never occurs to either one of them, I suppose, to pursue another way of making a living. They are beholden to the spreading sunsets of this forever landscape, to the smells of water irrigating a dry field, to color of rice at harvest, like burnt butter. They are beholden to the dirt. And I have to admit that I am too. I love to go look at fields, and it's nice to live in Kansas City because you can go right out of Kansas City and there are fields. You don't have to wait long. Well, I want to give you a little advice if you decide you really have to write anymore. First of all, know when you're a child that you're going to write one. And then you interview all of your kin and you can ask the right questions. I didn't do that. I let them all die. And then I thought, wait a minute, my grandmother eloped from Belgium to marry my grandfather after he'd already come over to the States. And she was 17 and she'd been forbidden by her parents to do this. Why didn't I ask her? Oh no, I was too busy doing my own thing. So don't do that. Interview them now if they're still alive. And then the second piece of advice I have is to wait until everybody who might protest about your memoir is dead. It makes your life so much easier. You don't have to deal with it. Well, in writing the memoir, I tried to summon the lost, and I didn't have much luck. Because you really cannot ever summon them. They have their own lives, and they like to stay put where they are. Thank you very much. They just like it there. And this finally dawns on you after you finish the book and you think, wait a minute, still don't know who they are. Memoir. Until my ancestors died, they were symbols. Acronyms who neither laughed or suffered for long or cigarettes or soap or gardenias. Now in death, they step forward with moles on their arms, caps on their teeth, and shoes with broken heels. They have places to go they'll never take me. People to love will never hear my name. Crops to plant and butter to churn. Letters to write and shirts to iron. All that Protestant industry. I, who thought once to be the center of their universe, step aside as they prance and turn, knowing they don't see me, wondering that they ever did. Thanks for listening. I'd like to hear your comments, questions. I know some of you are writing, that's why I know you are.
Do you think your sister has run the book?
I don't know. And I probably will never know. It's unfortunate that it has happened that way. She may write her own book. Of course, there's two sides to every story. The problem between us was that there was enough to go around for both of us. But she just seemed to want her share and mine too. And I took a little exception to that. But I don't know. And I don't, I used to have a kind of a gossip line down in DeWitt, Arkansas, where I'm from. And she lives, I think she lives there part-time. But that person's gone away, and I don't ever hear anything. It's terrible. Where's the gossip in this house? Yeah.
Memoir, memory. How much research did you have to do,
Well,
as opposed to just sitting down and remembering?
I did a lot of research. My mother and father were not quite to the point of being hoarders like you see on TV, but they're pretty close. They were close. They saved everything, and so there were tons of letters to go through. And I spent a lot of time going through letters to validate what I thought had happened. I found the love letters between my mother and father the year before they were married. That wasn't like me. That was fun research. We had the father of our brother-in-law had written a wonderful history of the rice farm in Arkansas, starting from the very beginning of it. And I am kind of a pack rat too, and I kept that, and I dug it out, and that was a big help to me. So I did a lot of research on that. There's a museum of the Arkansas Grand Prairie in Stuttgart, which is not far from Little Rock, and I went there. Online, there's an encyclopedia of Arkansas literature and culture. That was a big help. But oh, how I longed for the real people that could remember how it was. I mean, across the field from us was my grandfather's brother-in-law, from which my grandfather had learned to raise rice in Louisiana. Now, that man died way before I was born, but his widow lived on and on and on. I remember her. Did I ever think to ask her what that was like? No, I was too busy dating Charles. Running around, being me. I'd never asked. She could have told me what it was like on those early days at the farm, carving out that land. And it's interesting that my grandfather, the whole clan, 9 of them came, his mother and father and 7 kids, came over from Belgium to escape what they perceived as Protestants to be Catholic persecution. They thought that they were not getting work as cabinet makers because of that, which may have been not true. They got to New Orleans, which they decided to on New Orleans because it's French speaking. They couldn't find work there. And somebody said, "Well, going up to Crowley, Louisiana, there's work there. You can get on it. You can work on the rice farms." My grandfather knew nothing about rice. But this man who became his brother-in-law taught him everything he knew. They lost 2 crops. Both of them invested everything in rice farming in Louisiana. Lost 2 crops because the salt water came in through the pumps, and you have to have water to raise rice, and it burned the rice and killed it. So they trekked on up to Arkansas, where my grandfather said, "I'm going where the damn salt water can't get into rice." So that's how I came to be born in Arkansas. But I did, and then I also had one elderly cousin who remembered my father and mother and remembered my grandparents. I did have sense enough to go see him before he died. At Charles's insistence, he kept saying, "If you don't go, it's going to be too late." So we went and interviewed my cousin Victor, who interviewed my parents and my grandparents. But yeah, memory's not enough. And the other thing to remember is that a memoir is not your whole life. It's one little focused part. And that helps you stay sane. Otherwise, you just have too many places to go. So mine was concentrating on growing up on a rice farm with the backdrop of World War II, trying to understand this vast array of cousins and uncles and aunts, these quirky people, from about the age of 5 to about 17 when I went off to college. Any other? Steve?
Any plans to write the next volume?
Are you kidding? Not right now. I feel like maybe. There are some things I'd like to write about. It's really hard work. Writing poetry is hard, but sustaining a storyline for me was difficult. It's not that many pages even, but it was blood, sweat, and tears almost. I'd like to write about my daughter. I'm thinking that might be a good thing to tribute to her.
How helpful was the University of Arkansas? Did you have a book editor?
Oh, I had excellent help. I had actually 3 editors who helped. One, kind of in charge. But then I sent out to about 8 people. That's another thing I would say. You want many sets of eyes looking at this work that you're doing. And I had a cousin, a little bit younger than I, who had kept up with family more than I. And he and his wife were just a great help because they're interested in the family tree. And they had a family tree to give to me. And so that was really helpful. What was the question?
I'm wondering if you can have this book reprinted by a different press, a little bit more national distribution.
Oh, when Knopf calls, I'll probably say yes. When Hollywood calls, I'll say yes, I'll see anyone. It is, yeah, I think, I don't know, I'll have to look at my contract, but probably after a certain number of years, one can do that. But you asked me about the press. You're not always fortunate to get a press like I had. I mean, they were patient with me. Sometimes for many reasons I couldn't meet the deadline, and they'd say, that's okay. We'll go ahead and extend it. I had an excellent copy editor. And people have asked me about self-publishing. I don't see anything wrong with self-publishing, but if you do, you have got to hire yourself. Invest in a copy editor. It's just invaluable. You cannot spot all your mistakes. Even as an English comp teacher, I made mistakes I won't even tell you about because I shouldn't have made them. But I didn't see it. And a good copy editor, which the Arkansas Press provided free to me, was very, very helpful. You know that from having published fiction, you've got to have someone else looking at it. Yeah. And even then, there are some mistakes that slip through.
Were there stories that you remember that then when you actually did research, you discovered that you didn't remember the story exactly right, that you had it, that it wasn't actually the uncle who did this, it was the brother or somebody else, or whatever, stories that were sort of half memories, and you discovered that the records actually result.
I discovered that my father had told me things that weren't true. But I guess his father told him that there were legends in the family that may or may not be true. For instance, about my grandmother eloping from Belgium to New Orleans. That she did. She did do that. She did come from Belgium to New Orleans. But Charles and I were fortunate enough to go to Europe about 5 or 6 years ago now. And we found one remaining relative who had not known my grandparents but had lived in the same town and knew the stories firsthand. And so I asked her through an interpreter, I said, is it true that my grandmother was disowned by her parents? She said, heavens no. They were glad to get rid of her. They were so glad that somebody came along that could afford her. But see, now, I'm still not sure which story is true, and I still choose to believe the one about they disowned her. But it is true that my father did not see those grandparents in Belgium for 10 years. He was 10 years old when they went back. So there must have been something going on. But there are unreliable narrators all over the place. I did find in the research about, going to the online encyclopedia, talking with my older cousin Victor, some things that were connected that I had thought were true and weren't true. Well, despite all the things I've said about not writing one, it is a pleasure to write one after you get through it. And even if you don't have literary aspirations to get it closed, if you have a family, you have children, and if you don't, someday you probably will, write it down. It doesn't have to be great literature, but they will love having the stories. I found a diary of my grandmother, Gateways, where all she did was put down the time and temperature, the temperature of the day, and how she felt. And I devoured it. I just thought it was fabulous. There wasn't anything in it greatly interesting, but that was her take on that day. In years and years. You've been a great audience. I'll meet you out at the book signing table. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.